So I'm delighted to chair this panel. This morning's presentations will address shared histories shaped by colonial violence and draw connections between past and present in the face of the climate emergency. I have borrowed this term, colonial afterlives, from a recent volume edited by Wayne Modest and Claudia Augustat, titled Spaces of Care, Confronting Colonial Afterlives in European Ethnographic Museums. So that book looks into museums' complex entanglements with colonialism and also museum practices that, through collaborative, critical reflexivity, address the urgent and defining challenges of the 21st century that they identify as planetary precarity, inequality, and issues regarding the futures of multiculturalism or plural democracies. So all of these ideas, I think that they resonate with the papers presented today. And given today's topic, I must say, of course, that I'm thinking about the horrific violence that we are currently witnessing in Gaza. Just format-wise, each presentation will be 15 minutes, so I will let you know when your time is running out. And after the 4 papers have been delivered, I will introduce each of the speakers. And after the 4 papers have been delivered, I will invite the speakers to come to the front again and join us for discussion and Q&A. So I ask everyone to write any questions and comments down and save them until we reach this point, just to help with timekeeping. And I think that's it. So let me introduce our first speakers, Mirjam Linschooten and Skye Maule O'Brien. Mirjam is a Dutch visual artist living and working in Amsterdam. Her practice includes publications, film, installation, photography, and writing. As a research artist, her work is concerned with tactics of representation, questioning the way memory and history are constructed through various forms of collecting, interpreting, and display. She has exhibited internationally, including in the United States, Canada, France, Egypt, Indonesia, Morocco, and the Netherlands. And Skye is a creative researcher and educator working between Rotterdam, Montreal, and Barbados. Combining theory, narrative, visual methods, and materials, her collaborative practice engages with a theory developed during her PhD called intimate pedagogy. She employs intimacy and vulnerability as creative, critical, and transformative tools. At the Willem de Kooning Academy, she's a research fellow in social practices, leads interdisciplinary projects, and the colonial shifts in the curriculum. Welcome.
All right. Hi, everyone. Good morning. And thank you for having us here at St. Andrews University for the Transnational Island Museologies Conference. My name is Mirjam Linschooten, and you pronounced it very well. I know it's. And I'm here with Skye Maule O'Brien, who will speak after me. And we're happy to share here some aspects of our current and ongoing research, Breath and Breathe, Tongueless Whispers of the Wind. This is a collaborative research creation project in which we critically examine how the Netherlands shaped and continues to haunt life in the Caribbean, following the wind, to gain a deeper understanding of how shared histories, colonial histories, continue to connect and implicate us today. Obviously, the Caribbean is a vast area, and for this presentation, we will focus on the island of Barbados, where we have done research last February. I grew up in the Netherlands. I'm a Dutch visual artist, and I was born in Leiden and grew up in the town of Noordwijk, which is where this photo was taken. Growing up in the Netherlands, especially by the sea, meant a lot of biking against the wind. Some of my earliest memories are around wind, rain, biking, And my mother, who always wanted to take a different route home, regardless of the weather, or whether that route was longer. So I had experienced wind in this very basic way, but I had not really considered its implications in many other ways. Until later in life, I started researching Dutch colonial heritage and its afterlives, such as the trade winds, and their role in Dutch colonial history in the Caribbean region and many other regions worldwide. About a year ago, I discovered that one of my ancestors was a miller on this windmill near Leiden. This is a water mill, as in a windmill to displace water for the maintenance of groundwater level of a polder by pumping away excess water. Polder as in land claimed from the sea. These windmills have been an important instrument throughout the centuries to control water and landscapes in the Netherlands. Situated below sea level, the Netherlands emerged from water as an inverted island by use of such windmills and faces urgent climate consequences today. Although often associated with a nostalgic idea of natural power, windmills have been serving colonial systems and are connected to multiple violent histories. Barbados, specifically, once had more windmills than any country outside the Netherlands. Although Barbados was a British colony, the Dutch collaborated through trade and sharing of knowledge, such as wind technology in the 17th century. This is a new map of the island of Barbados, and it's from circa 1682. And when you zoom in, you can see the landscape being crowded with windmills at the time. These were used for the production of sugar on sugar plantations. Today, the remains of these windmills are a collection that holds and tells hidden histories and stories. For our research on Barbados, we visited different windmill remains throughout the island. Today, they stand in the altered landscape as sturdy stone blocks, like a kind of unintentional monument, sometimes overgrown or unapproachable, sometimes turned into a restaurant or standing in someone's garden, a sign of something that still lingers, but is unspoken. Their shapes are a glimpse of a long and deep history, but the mills do not easily let themselves be known. Something about these towers cannot be grasped. They are elusive, like the wind. And wind is a force that we focus on in our research as well, moving through different spaces and connecting various locations. For our research so far, we have interviewed a Dutch historian of Barbadian heritage, and in Barbados, 3 museologists, an artist, an architect, a scholar, a poet, and an economist about their knowledge of this history and their experiences with wind. We also attempted to interview a meteorologist, but we were refused. I mention this because refusals can bring as much material to a project sometimes as the conversations that do happen, which Skye will also get into. Among other things, we were interested to know more about the collection of aerosol samples, which, as we understood it, happens almost daily, year-round. How are these samples collected? Are they stored somewhere? We started imagining storage spaces full of glass vials, looking empty, while holding invisible information. But the answer to our request, which no doubt sounded a bit strange to them, was that what we thought was a simple question, they needed 3 scientists to answer, which they had no time for. When I shared with a friend of mine, Herman, that our interview request got declined, he answered, "You could always do like Duchamp," and sent me a link of the work of Air de Paris by French artist Marcel Duchamp, a ready-made glass vial that Duchamp purchased and filled with Paris air for a friend. The glass vessel appears to contain nothing at all, forcing the viewer to question what exactly, if anything, the vial holds. So we decided to take on my friend's advice and purchased empty glass bottles at a Bridgetown perfume shop and started our own collection of aerosol samples. We were not really sure what we were doing, if we were doing it the right way, but our wind collection keeps growing. And to continue, we'd like to invite you to pass this bottle through the room from one person to the next, so we can add a St. Andrews sample to our collection of locations where we brought this object. And Skye will continue from here.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. My name is Skye, as Mirjam said, and I'm a creative researcher and educator living in Rotterdam. I'm going to try and do multiple things at once here by reading off my computer and pressing enter. All right. So I'm going to continue with this line of thinking on resistance and refusal as a really important part of our project, and also what it may offer other work that attempts to critically make visible these invisible links that tie us together, such as wind or the air that we breathe. So as was mentioned in my bio, my personal practice centers intimacy and vulnerability as key elements of addressing the difficult knowledge or transformative learning that I think is required in any anti or decolonial work. And for me, often that means a specific attention to how race functions and moves within this work. So our ongoing project, we are combining theory, narrative, and auto theory towards a collective publication that looks at, which will also include looking at how whiteness shifts and shapes research. And we're exploring what outcomes and openings resistance can offer when traditional forms of research are refused. So Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, they understand refusal as dynamic and multiple. They argue that in research, refusal critique and challenge settler colonial logic of transparency, its constructions of whiteness, regimes of representation, assumed self-defined ethics, and the right to know. And rather than this being seen as a subtractive or prohibitory move, they really view refusals as a potential redirection to confront what otherwise be seen as unacknowledged or unquestioned. So revealing and concealing are really political acts. And Edward Glissant sees the right to refuse transparency also as an essential part of research and relationships that are committed to decoloniality. He writes that opacity is a prerequisite to any anti-colonial stance, and that acts without the necessity to make others in our image. And this, he clarifies, that opacity does not act as an impenetrable closure, but like resistance, brings with it a freedom to accept that there will always be things that remain unknowable or inaccessible, including even parts of ourselves. And this acts as an important reminder that to do research within these anti-colonial or decolonial frameworks, it should be a challenge to extractive forms of research that encourage or celebrate this uncritical or consumptive data collecting. So in a project such as ours, incorporating this analysis of refusal is also crucial to interrogate the ways these colonial structures still hold our relational lives, and these areas of friction allow for different forms of understanding to emerge and also place a greater responsibility on those who inhabit whiteness, such as ourselves, to confront the meanings that our bodies signal and the colonial patterns research that which we may be attached to. So I often begin presentations by speaking to my relationship to the land that I'm currently on, but today it's kind of coming a bit closer to the end. So following the title of this conference, Transnational Islands and Hidden Stories, our life and work are very much a confluence and conversation between islands and lowlands, as Mirjam shared. I was born to a Scottish mother on unceded Anishinaabe territory as a settler in Canada. She named me after an island here in Scotland, one that I've never been to. And then as an adult, I mostly lived on the island of Tchotchke, which is commonly known as Montreal, and I now live below sea level in Rotterdam. Barbados is another island that I've been lucky enough to call home. And like Canada, the arrival of Europeans led to mass exploitation and pushed Indigenous knowledge and peoples from the lands. And much of my work stretches across the Atlantic, drawing parallels between these seemingly disparate places to explore shared histories and also to encourage decolonial knowledge formation and hopefully action. I consider myself a guest on all of these lands, and I'm learning with the people with and from those who've built knowledge there. And acknowledging a land is a tradition I've learned about, and it's also about paying respect to Indigenous peoples and lands and the treaty agreements that I was born into. But I take the time here to point out these relationships to recognize that, not only to recognize the responsibility that my body carries, but also to illustrate the complexity and layers of connection between all of us in this space and with the soils, the sediment, the ridges, the gullies, and the glens, which we're entangled. So I close, or we close, with a return to the wind. The resistance and friction we spoke about has come in multiple forms throughout our project, such as the example of the declined interview, but also in our experiences of attempting to listen to the wind. The wind can agitate, unsettle, disrupt, disturb, and it demands particular attention from our bodies, seemingly speaking of something that can be quite difficult to articulate. Employing intimacy with the wind as a part of the project has at times required us to pause and reflect on the information being processed within our bodies. But this project embraces the visceral process as an active, slow researching that requires us to inhabit the discomforts of this type of resistance. Instead of discarding the difficult data, we're looking at the frictions as cracks where new forms of knowing can seep in, and understanding that elements will remain shadowed offers generative opportunities to think about information that is gathered and exchanged and what it means to create new forms of knowing of shared histories in relation across geographical spaces and time. In her writing about the contradictions of forming narratives through the use of colonial archives, Saidiya Hartman shares that her aim is to both tell an impossible story and to amplify the impossibility of its telling. This is my apartment in Rotterdam. In many ways, this project attempts something similar. The windmills remains act as an archive that is inseparable from the colonial powers and the plantation economies that shaped the landscape of Barbados and all those who have lived there, and are listening to the trade winds and those who breathe the circulating currents as a form or a way to understand how these histories implicate each of us in the present, simultaneously does point to the impossibility of ever fully hearing the story they have to tell. Thanks.
Thank you so much, William. We have very limited time for questions, but let's take at least a couple of questions, maybe from the audience. I don't know if we have enough time, unfortunately, but are there any questions? Yes, many. Yeah, go ahead. Please come, and we'll just use some of the refreshment time, at least 5 minutes, to have a chance to discuss. Yeah, so I can get us started if that's okay. I noticed that some of your presentations touched on the issue of gender. Of course, we saw Kihara's rereading of Gauguin, the questioning of unsettling strict gender binaries. And I know that Mirjam and Skye, I know that you also, your work is very much informed by feminist theory as well. So yeah, maybe we can discuss a little bit more about the issue of gender within the decolonial approach of your projects.
Yes, gender and colonialism. Yeah, I mean, it's an obvious one in Yuki's work, because this strict imposition of gender binaries meant that suddenly her gender and the counterpart of her gender was no longer acceptable, and led to discrimination, which is still ongoing today. And they noticed that specifically during the pandemic, for instance, because that was a time that people went back to their families. And for her community, she realized that they couldn't go back to their families. And that's what kind of really made her think about, the need to create more work. I mean, all of her work is about gender as well as everything else. But I think she really wanted to involve her community much more in her artwork. And the nice thing is that Paradise Camp at the moment is in Samoa. It just opened there, which for her was the most important location. It wasn't the Venice Biennale, which is prestigious, but it's currently in Samoa. So yeah, it's just one of these colonial legacies, like so many others.
I think in our project, it might not, explicitly speak about gender, but for all my projects and my own theoretical framing, they're all always have been informed by, radical feminist theories of like Black, Caribbean, Indigenous, ecofeminist critique. So it's always, interwoven into sort of any analysis that I would do or any project that I would do. And race, gender, these like intersectional approaches, I think are, just integral to these projects. So even though it might not explicitly talk about it, I think it's always present.
This is part of the methodology.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
I very much appreciated all of the presentations, and the many, many different ways of discussing the work or analyzing the work or deliberating about the work. But the key thing that I think comes across for all of them is the point of islandness and the point of precarity and lack of visibility within the historical or historicizing framework. And in this instance, it would appear that contemporary art responses to that lack of being in a historical sense was the way to go, or did it find you, or did you deliberately, start discussing with contemporary artists how to address those issues of non-entity, where there was a necessity to achieve a real being? I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, but this was very, very clear to me in all cases. And of course, beyond this, so I want you to discuss the issue of islandness and its or rather, in many instances, its ahistoricity, and how that has been addressed by the kinds of work that you're doing in conjunction with contemporary artists, both performative and visual.
I think it's a brilliant question. I think that was really the crux of coming together and in this co-creative process, is to, start from our own positionalities to begin with, but also looking into the archives and to those, hidden voices that are not quite there, and how to pull them out and from the fragments really recenter these stories. And there is an islandness to it. And I think there is I didn't reflect much on this, but with other work that we do, in terms of food systems change, climate change, there are these movements over time for improvement, for example, for which then became development, which generally are centered around capturing land for industrial production systems, which I think have parallels on either side of the Atlantic, and parallel stories could be told there.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think for me as a Dutch artist, it's been quite interesting and productive to at least momentarily look at the Netherlands as an island. Like I said, it's like an inverted island coming from the water. And I thought the notion of the ocean being a connecting force rather than separating, it's really beautiful. And thus also seeing how the Netherlands connects to regions such as the Caribbean and these histories. And understanding that also the wind, is such an important force in that helps us understand how some of these connections might, have existed in the past, but still exist today. And I think as an artist, I'm always looking for, how can you start showing this to people through new associations? I think a lot of people in the Netherlands have no clue about this history, about this connection. I mean, they have a clue about a connection with the Caribbean, but then they see it as, Curacao, and it's a holiday island. The windmill as an icon, like I said, for this nostalgic idea of natural power, to start changing these views and what these different, let's say, tropes mean. For me, it's been a very productive way of approaching that.
Yeah, and I think lastly as well, thinking about these island stories, we have to also consider, in addition to this legacy, this tangible heritage. So we've talked about the windmills in Barbados, these monuments that kind of dot the landscape, but also intangible heritage and stories that are less visible. So I was thinking about, an industrial agricultural economy such as Barbados, and then obviously this refining, this commodity, sugar, this sort of global commodity, and where in other islands that's perhaps less visible, but these invisible power structures. So thinking about Tate and Lyle, or their sort of connections to this troubling history, and even someone such as Cara Walker and her sphinxes, and the Domino sugar refinery in New York. But there's this sort of troubling resonance there with this commodity such as sugar, but also honoring those hidden histories and power structures that we've talked about in this conference as well.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. I invite everyone to continue the conversation over a cup of tea. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to our brilliant speakers. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and especially to the student volunteers who helped run the session smoothly. Thank you.